my developer friends. So before we dig into the next assignment, before you dig into the next assignment, I just want to give you some things to think about. So far, you've learned how to render a page with a form, do some data binding to collect information from the form and put it directly into an object that you will later put into the database. You also have learned how to render things to the page. You've also learned how to get things from the database. So putting all these things together, we're also going to add on relationships, right? So before we get started, I want you to think about what information you need to render this page. And you go ahead and pause the video. So in this case, you do definitely need to get all of the dojos from the database. So that will require from the controller calling a service, which in turn calls the repository, which will behind the scenes write the SQL or do the SQL to call the database to get all the dojos out, and it'll percolate back up, return those list of dojos, that list of dojos from the repository to the service, and then in turn from the service to the controller, and then you can actually render on the page finally. So that's that. We also though have to pass in an empty dojo object in order to bind it to this form. So it's going to be bound to the JSP. So we're waiting for the user to type in that location so that we can stuff it into an empty object and then finally save it in that method, in that request. So let's look how this looks like, what this looks like in code. Well, actually, let's list what we're going to do first. So we have the dojo. We're going to think about for the dojo, what do we need to create a dojo? And then for Ninja, what do we need to create a Ninja? And then lastly, what is this model attribute? So that's the other thing we're going to go over. Okay, so let's look at some code. I'm going to go to, we have our new dojo page, and it looks like a lot of code, but you guys have done all of this before, and you can do it again. All of this has happened before, and it will happen again. So for our dojo, we have a form here, and it has to be form tags, the JSTL form tags, so that we can do the data binding, right? And you'll notice there's a difference here in all of the inputs. For one, we also have this form errors input as part of the form. And instead of this name attribute that we usually have for our tags, we now have this path, and it has to be path. Now, can we put anything we want here in the names? The answer is actually no. It has to correspond with a member variable in our model, right? Or a field in our database in the dojos table, right? So this location has to be, this path name location has to be some member variable in our class, right? So likewise, we should really just look at the model when we're creating our forms to determine what we need to put into it, right? In this case, with a dojo, we have an ID that gets auto-generated, as well as a created at and updated at. You can zoom in on the actual declaration of those private variables. So the ID and the created at and updated at do not need to be put in the form because they get created automatically. Now we also have two other member variables here. We have the location, which is a string, as well as this list of ninjas. Don't forget about this. It is a member variable, but it's a relationship. And because it's a one-to-many, and when you create a new dojo, you don't actually have to include the list of ninjas because you don't have any ninjas yet to associate with it, right? So that's really all we need is the location. So now that I've checked my member variables to see what I need to put in the form so that it can bind to this empty dojo, which we'll look at in a second, I have everything I need, right? So when I press submit, I go back to my controller. We'll go to the dojos, the post method down here, And really, this is what collects that dojo into an actual object. And at that point, really all we have to do is pass that dojo that we sent in to be created, right? We call the service, we pass in the dojo, done and done. So again, this model attribute dojo is really important. And it actually matches when the model attribute up here that you send into the page. So very, very important to remember. There's a few things that need to match, right? So you have to have this dojo. The model attribute, when you're rendering the page, has to match this model attribute dojo here. It's very important to know. This one is going to be sent here, has to be the same. Actually, it has to be the same as this one right here. This is really the attribute that you need. Let me just erase that real quick. And it's okay. So that, there we go. That's the one that actually is going to correspond. Likewise, just like we saw before, the paths in your form have to match the model member variables, right? Likewise, if we look, we scroll a little bit down to the dojo method, the post method that processes the dojo, that also has to match those two, right? So this has to match also that model attribute. So just some things to keep in mind. All right, now let's go back to our list of things to consider. So that's the dojo. Let's go to actually the ninja. So when we're creating a new ninja, we'll do the same thing. We'll look at our model, just determine what we need to render a new ninja. So we've considered the dojo. We know we need to have that empty model attribute. And and you can call it whatever it needs to be. In this case, dojo, right? And we have to send that into the form. So we need that. We also need the list of all the dojos. Great. Okay, so to create a new ninja, we only have a form on that page. So let's go back and look at our form versus our database. So now when we go to create a new ninja, we'll look at the ninja class to determine what it is we need to include in our form. So again, we'll look at each one in turn. ID gets auto-generated. I'm going to move these down here. I don't know why my setters and getters are up here. I always like to keep it really uniform. I have my member variables at the top, then my constructors, and then all my setters and getters. It's a really good idea to keep your code very organized. Okay, side note. So ID gets generated, created at updated get generated. So we just have to look at any remaining member variables. So we have first name, last name. Okay, so I'll need inputs for that, first name, last name. And again, let's just draw those boxes. That first name member variable has to match this first name path, right? This last name member variable also needs to match this last name path. Great. But we have one more attribute here, and that is this many to one, right? There actually is a member variable that exists here. Just like there was a ninja's list in the dojo class, there is a dojo member variable. That is a dojo instance. You can see the type here is actually of type dojo, right? So that is something that we actually do need to include in the form, and that's because it's a many to one. So every ninja that we create has to have a dojo already associated with it when we create the ninja, right? By the design we have for this particular assignment. So again, these have to match, right? And then we have to have another input. Now, typically, you might have a hidden input with some many to one relationship, or you could have the user pick from a drop-down menu, right? So in this case, I don't have the drop-down menu quite yet. I do have the actual select tag for the drop-down menu, but I don't have a for loop going over all the dojos. So you will need to include that. But for right now, I just have one dojo that you can select from. So you are definitely going to need to change that in your project. But for this dojo, again, those two things have to match. So let's take a look one more time. So this member variable dojo has to correspond with which part of this? Right here. So the path has to correspond with the member variable name. But notice that for a drop-down menu, I also have to have a value. And that value is going to be a dojo that I send into the page. And in your case, when you do a for loop, you're going to do a for loop over all of the dojos. So for this new ninja, you'll also have to get all the dojos out of the database, put them into the page, and then for loop over them to get each of those dojos. So when they select it, you can send back that dojo. So you might think, okay, well, now I have to get all of these input values from the request parameters, but that's actually not the case. And that's because you have this model attribute that you sent in, right? And that is a Ninja instance, right? An empty Ninja instance, but a Ninja instance. And so when the user fills in those input fields, first name, last name, and the strings, and this one where they pick the dojo, all those things are going to fill up that Ninja object and then send it back to your controller, right? So let's look at that controller. All right. So when you create a new Ninja, we go back to some post route, presumably. And what we have here is now the filled Ninja object that we got back from the form, right? So again, we sent in an empty Ninja object and we got back a filled Ninja object that included the associated dojo, right? Okay. Hopefully that's enough information to get you started. So good luck, have fun. I'll see you on the other side.